The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. That's it. Every battle, every betrayal, every war crime in this entire conflict. 3 years. Geonosis to Order 66, start to finish, 22 BBY to 19 BBY. 3 years. And once you actually map out everything that happened inside those 3 years, not just what happened, but how much, and why that much, and who needed it to be exactly that much, you will never look at any of this the same way again. This isn't a chronological walkthrough. You know this story. What you've never been handed is the frame around it, a mounting case for why the most devastating conflict in galactic history was compressed into only 36 months, why it ended exactly when it did, and why that compression is itself the evidence that one man had his hand on both triggers from the beginning. The Clone Wars didn't happen to end when they did. They were scheduled to end when they did. And Order 66 wasn't a tragedy that happened to the war. It was the war's only real purpose. Start the clock. Before Geonosis, before a single clone boot hit red desert sand, a Jedi named Sifo-Dyas had already been to Kamino. Over a decade before the war, over a decade, he commissioned an army. Secretly, without Republic authorization. Sifo-Dyas was a Jedi Master from Minashee who foresaw galactic conflict coming with enough clarity to act unilaterally. And when the Jedi Council rejected his warnings and removed him from their ranks, he went around them entirely. He contacted the Kaminoans and placed an order for a clone army, funded in his name, grown in accelerated gestation tanks on an ocean world the Republic had never officially mapped. He was dead before the first clone reached adulthood. Count Dooku handled that. Dooku co-opted the program after Sifo-Dyas' death, inserted bounty hunter Jango Fett as the genetic template over the original specifications, and handed Palpatine a standing army, loyal, accelerated, and waiting, that the Republic would discover at exactly the right moment and deploy to fight exactly the war for which it had been designed years in advance. The architecture here is worth sitting with. The Republic didn't commission this army. A dead Jedi did, at the direction of someone who then killed him. The Separatist crisis that would eventually justify deploying that army hadn't happened yet when the clones were first ordered. The war had a standing army before it had a reason to exist. The Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY isn't the beginning of the story. It's the moment Palpatine revealed that he'd already built both the fire and the water to put it out. To understand why 3 years is the only number that matters, you have to go back 1,000 years before Geonosis. Around 1000 BBY, the Sith had armies, real ones, fleets, legions, generals, warships, and the full institutional weight of declared military power. The Great Hyperspace War, the Old Sith Wars, the New Sith Wars. Centuries of Sith campaigns launched directly at the Jedi Order and the Republic in open conflict. Every one of them ended the same way. The Sith destroyed, fragmented, consumed by their own internal logic. Not always because the Jedi outfought them, though that happened too, but because powerful Sith in close proximity to other powerful Sith aren't allies. They are competitors, waiting for an opening. The Brotherhood of Darkness, the last major Sith collective before Bane's reforms, collapsed from within when its members started eliminating each other for rank and resources. A Sith Lord named Darth Bane watched this pattern and named the problem with precision. He understood that an organization built on the premise that power is the supreme value will always turn that premise on itself. His solution was structural. Strip the order down to 2. 1 master, 1 apprentice. No armies, no public declarations, no frontal assaults on anything. The Sith would operate in absolute shadow, accumulating influence through patience and infiltration. And each generation would push the plan 1 increment further toward completion. His first apprentice was Darth Zana. The rule of 2 would continue through her, and through whoever she trained, down through 1,000 unbroken years of darkness the galaxy would never see coming. Because the galaxy had been reassured, repeatedly and credibly, that the Sith were extinct. That assumption was Bane's actual weapon, not armies, The assumption of safety. Darth Bane appears as a Force vision to Yoda in Season 6 of The Clone Wars, in an episode called Sacrifice, voiced appropriately by Mark Hamill. And he had been dead for 1,000 years at that point. The rule of two had been running that long. For 10 centuries, 2 Sith at a time nursed a plan toward fruition that no single lifetime could complete. Each master training an apprentice. Each apprentice eventually strong enough to kill the master and take their place, which Bane deliberately designed into the structure, because a Sith who can't defeat their own master isn't ready to face the Jedi Order. What Bane built was a millennial patience engine. The Sith were gone. Everyone said so. The Jedi Council debated whether they were extinct. By the Clone Wars era, the Order's working assumption was threat neutralized, centuries ago. Nothing to worry about. Now compare that to Darth Malgus, an Old Republic-era Sith who flew warships directly into the Jedi Temple on Coruscant and let them crash through the walls. Overwhelming force, no subtlety, immediate gratification. The strategic logic. Enough firepower and enough willingness to use it can take any target. Tactically, it sometimes worked. Historically, it always failed. The Sith who fought like Malgus kept losing because they were announcing themselves, forcing the Jedi onto maximum alert, spending irreplaceable resources on battles that produced no lasting result. Every crashed ship was a declaration of intent. Declarations of intent are what get you surrounded. Palpatine never crashed a ship into anything. Palpatine got himself elected. He ingratiated himself with every Jedi Master who had opinions about Senate politics. He attended their ceremonies, remembered the names of their Padawans, positioned himself as the steady, reasonable civilian authority that a warrior order needed to remain grounded. He was the most powerful man in the galaxy, and he used that power specifically to appear indispensable. A compassionate chancellor in an era of rising tensions, a steady hand during a crisis he was manufacturing in the basement. The Clone Wars are what 1,000 years of accumulated Sith patience looks like when it finally executes. Not a war the Sith won, the most sophisticated political operation in galactic history, wearing a war as camouflage. Here's what Palpatine actually built, and how he ran both sides simultaneously. On the Republic side, Palpatine held the Chancellor's office, which the Separatist crisis elevated from a standard executive role into something close to emergency autocracy. He orchestrated the Military Creation Act, the legislation that authorized the Republic to form the Grand Army and deploy it, by manufacturing the conditions that made its passage feel inevitable and urgent. The clone army on Kamino was presented as a fortunate discovery, a ready-made solution to an escalating crisis the Senate was desperate to resolve. The Emergency Powers Act, passed in the conflict's first hours, extended Palpatine's authority to authorize military operations without full Senate deliberation. Emergency powers granted for the duration of the conflict. A conflict Palpatine was controlling. He would decide when the emergency was over. Every expansion of his authority was legal. Every vote was won legitimately. The Senate handed him what he needed, crisis by crisis, session by session. That's the mechanism Darth Bane understood, and the Brotherhood of Darkness never did. If you make your enemies grant you power willingly, they can't take it back without admitting they were fools to give it. On the Separatist side, Count Dooku, publicly the ideological leader of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, secretly answered to Darth Sidious directly. The Clone Wars series makes this explicit. Sidious contacts Dooku mid-campaign to redirect military operations, issues orders that the CIS's own generals don't understand as Sith chess moves, and establishes the hierarchy's true nature through scenes where he force-chokes Dooku without preamble when the reminder seems necessary. Publicly, the leader of a principled political secession. Privately, an operational asset receiving instructions from the Supreme Chancellor of the government he was publicly fighting. What Dooku didn't fully understand, and this is the part that makes Palpatine genuinely terrifying, is that he had an expiration date stamped on him from the beginning. Palpatine had been cultivating Anakin Skywalker since the boy was 10 years old. Since Naboo. Before the Separatist crisis materialized into anything concrete. Before the Military Creation Act. Before the first clone trooper was deployed. For 10 years leading into the Clone Wars, Palpatine had been Anakin's closest confidant in the Senate, the authority figure who never told him what he couldn't feel, who sympathized with his fear of loss, who treated the Chosen One's raw power as a gift rather than something requiring management and containment. He had been the one person in Anakin's life who never demanded emotional discipline in exchange for approval. For 10 years, Palpatine tended that relationship with the care of a man who knew precisely what he was cultivating. Dooku was holding the Confederacy together until Anakin was ready. Anakin would be ready precisely because the war Dooku was fighting was designed to grind him to a specific breaking point. Every year of combat, every moral compromise, every loss. The war ran exactly as long as Anakin needed to break. 3 years, because 3 years was what it took. The war started on Geonosis, 22 BBY, with organized chaos. Republic gunships screaming low over a red desert planet that had never seen this scale of combat. Clone troopers dropping into a full ground engagement they'd trained for their entire compressed lives, but never executed against live opposition. Jedi Knights, scholars and peacekeepers by philosophical identity, generals by emergency necessity, running military operations on the fly, issuing commands over battlefield communications, watching soldiers die in numbers that would have taken any conventional army months of active warfare to accumulate. The Republic deployed its first army in a generation, and within hours had already lost more men than any engagement in living memory. Padme Amidala got knocked out of a gunship and was nearly left in the desert in the scramble to regroup. Small detail, but it captures the texture of those first hours. Nobody had a plan that survived contact with the actual battle. Both armies deploying simultaneously, because both had been pre-positioned by the same architect, and the chaos was real, even if the conflict was engineered. Year 1. The clock was running. Within weeks of Geonosis, the Separatists deployed the Malevolence, a subjugator-class heavy cruiser equipped with twin mega-ion cannons, capable of disabling entire Republic fleets before moving in to systematically destroy the helpless ships and the living crews aboard them. The Republic had no counterweapon and no tactical doctrine for fighting it. One pulse, full fleet disabled, then destruction of everything that could no longer fight back. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin's newly assigned Padawan, a 14-year-old Togruta named Ahsoka Tano, improvised a solution in the middle of an active engagement, targeting the ion cannon's power coupling from inside the superstructure, while Republic medical transports full of wounded soldiers were in the cannon's kill zone. Ahsoka was 14. Year 1, already. The Battle of Christophsis followed in the same year, a grinding urban siege that introduced clone Captain Rex, designation CT-7567, in his first major documented engagement alongside Anakin and Ahsoka. Rex was different from the start. The accelerated growth program that produced all clone troopers was engineered for consistency. What it actually produced, when those men went into sustained combat and started making decisions under fire, was individuality. Rex developed tactical instincts beyond his programming, an emotional vocabulary the Kaminoans hadn't budgeted for, and command relationships with Anakin Skywalker that would eventually determine whether he lived past Order 66. That individuality wasn't supposed to happen. It happened anyway, because you can't grow human beings in tanks and then put them in a war for 3 years and expect them to stay identical. The clones deserve their own accounting, because without understanding what they were, the 3-year compression doesn't fully register. The Kaminoan growth program accelerated development at an elevated rate beyond standard biological pace. This was a deliberate design choice, built into the original commission, intended to produce combat-ready adults in years rather than decades. The war would consume their entire compressed adult lives. Many of them had known nothing else from the first moment they were aware of anything. Grown on Kamino, trained from the earliest stages of development for one specific function, deployed into a war that had been designed before they were born. The army was commissioned over a decade before Geonosis, which means that by 22 BBY, The oldest clone troopers had been alive for roughly a decade, aging at an accelerated rate, in preparation for a conflict they'd been told was inevitable. They were right. The conflict was always coming. It had been scheduled. And yet, against every institutional intention, these men became people. Rex became Rex. Cody became Cody. Fives became Fives. The combat and the losses and the proximity to death forced an individuality that the growth program hadn't planned for. They gave each other names, nicknames, armor markings, personal histories built within an institution that numbered them and considered them interchangeable. The Clone Wars animated series insists on this fact across 121 episodes. These were human lives. The war that consumed them in 3 years was consuming actual lives. This matters enormously for what comes later. When Order 66 activated, it activated inside men who had developed real identities, real loyalties, genuine relationships with the Jedi officers they were about to kill. The inhibitor chip, installed during growth on Kamino, listed in Kaminoan records as a behavioral inhibitor, present in every clone brain from the beginning, had to override all of that. It had to override what Rex felt about Anakin and what Cody felt about Obi-Wan, and what thousands of troopers in thousands of battalions had built through 3 years of surviving together. Most of the time, it worked. That is the horror of the design. 21 BBY. The war is 12 months old and already stretched to every corner of the galaxy. The Second Battle of Geonosis. The Mon Cala campaign, where Republic forces and Gungan reinforcements backed Crown Prince Lee Char against a Separatist-supported Quarren faction led by the aquatic commander Riff Tamson, a conflict that ended with Tamson killed and Lee Char crowned king, a Republic-aligned monarch placed on a strategically valuable world. The Republic was fighting on fronts so dispersed that no single commander could hold the full strategic picture. That was also by design. A war fought simultaneously on enough fronts is a war where the comprehensive view belongs only to the person who drew the map in the first place. Jedi generals could see their sector, their battalion, their current engagement. The Senate could see the political surface and the casualty figures. The military command structure could see supply chains and reinforcement schedules. Palpatine could see all of it, because he had designed all of it. This is also the year the Jedi's institutional compromise deepened past the point of easy recovery. The Order wasn't built to run military campaigns. Its philosophy demanded non-attachment, no political allegiance, no investment in specific outcomes, service to the Force rather than to institutions. 3 years of commanding clone battalions, of making tactical decisions that killed soldiers, of accepting military rank, of operating within a chain of command that ultimately terminated at the Chancellor's office, was doing something irreversible to the Order's relationship with both the Force and itself. Yoda acknowledges in Revenge of the Sith that the Jedi's power to use the Force had diminished. This isn't rhetorical modesty from a character who holds his own against Darth Sidious in single combat 15 minutes later in that same film. It's a genuine acknowledgement of a real phenomenon. Palpatine's mastery of dark side concealment had created what canonical sources describe as a veil over Jedi perception, an active clouding of their ability to sense his true nature. In canon, Palpatine confirms the mechanism directly. He clouded their minds as he had clouded others. He operated so close to the Order, for so long, with such sustained dark side presence at the center of the Republic, that the distortion became atmospheric. The Jedi were living inside the occlusion. They couldn't locate its edges because they couldn't stand outside it. 3 years of fighting a war they couldn't quite see clearly, commanded by a man whose nature they couldn't quite sense. 20 BBY, Ryloth, Umbara, Onderon, Dathomir. The middle of the war, and it's already generating wounds that won't close. The Ryloth campaign. The Republic liberates the Twi'lek homeworld from Separatist occupation. Mace Windu and Twi'lek resistance leader Cham Syndulla coordinate the ground operation, while Republic Star Destroyers clear the planetary blockade. The liberation is real. It also requires orbital bombardment and the displacement of civilian populations, and Cham Syndulla, a freedom fighter who had been resisting Separatist occupation with improvised resources before the Republic arrived, watches the liberation look increasingly like a different kind of occupation. He spends the rest of his life suspicious of the Republic he nominally allied with. The war was creating its own future resistance movements while it was still being fought. The Battle of Umbara is the one that lands differently from everything else in Year 2. A clone battalion is deployed to take Umbara, a lightless, hostile world with a population that had defected to the CIS. Assigned Jedi General, Pong Krell, a basilisk with 4 arms and a strategic record that looked impressive in the reports. What the reports didn't capture, Krell had already decided to betray the Republic. He had foreseen that the Republic would fall, calculated that Dooku's side would eventually win, and begun positioning himself for relevance in the new order by generating dramatic victories through what he privately considered acceptable losses. His method? Deploy clone troopers into suicidal positions without adequate intelligence briefings. Issue orders that guaranteed high casualties but produced tactical results he could take credit for. Treat the clones under his command as a renewable resource he was entitled to spend. Then he went further. In the darkness of Umbara, a planet lit only by alien bioluminescence, where everything hostile and nothing navigable, Krell issued orders sending 2 clone units against each other. Different armor configurations, each unit disguised in captured enemy gear, and he let them fight in the dark while he watched, waiting to see which element he could use the results to justify. They figured it out. Clone troopers, through tactical deduction and the slow recognition of fighting patterns that were too familiar to belong to droids, determined they were fighting other clones. They stopped. They traced the orders. They arrested Pong Krell. Then they executed him in the field, without a trial, because there was no tribunal available, and they understood that leaving him alive was a threat. Clone troopers arrested and shot a Jedi General. In Year 2 of a war that was supposed to be about the Republic defending democracy, the war's institutional violence was already eating itself from the inside, and there were still 14 months left. The Onderon arc ran in the same operational period, a guerrilla independence movement on a separatist-aligned world, morally complex in ways the war's official framing couldn't accommodate. The Onderon rebels were fighting for self-determination from a government the CIS had installed. Anakin, Obi-Wan, Rex, and Ahsoka traveled to Onderon to train them, teaching insurgency tactics, small unit coordination, and the specific art of fighting a better-equipped occupation force, on behalf of a republic that was simultaneously using overwhelming military force on Ryloth. The same institution, training freedom fighters on one world, running liberation bombardments on another in the same year. The Dathomir conflict. Count Dooku, responding to Asajj Ventress's attempted assassination of him, dispatched General Grievous and a droid army to Dathomir with orders to eliminate the Night Sister clan. An entire culture in their sleep, overnight, because one of that culture's members had gotten inconveniently close. Dooku didn't consult a parliament about that decision. He received instructions and executed them. The lines of this war were never straight. That was the point. The Separatists, the people the Republic was fighting, are the part of this story that gets flattened most often, and flattening them is a mistake. The tragedy of the Clone Wars depends entirely on the CIS being real. The political grievances that drove the secession were genuine. The Outer Rim had been neglected by the Republic for generations. Planets out there were being systematically exploited by corporate interests and ravaged by pirates with zero meaningful Republic intervention, no Senate representation that functioned in practice, and an economic relationship with the core worlds that extracted value and returned nothing. The Trade Federation, the Banking Clan, the Commerce Guild, their presence at the founding of the Confederacy wasn't incidental. They were the institutionalized form of the relationship between core power and outer neglect. When the Separatist crisis materialized, it materialized around real political despair that the Republic had spent generations earning. Count Dooku's public criticisms of the Republic were factually accurate within the Star Wars universe. He was a former Jedi Master who had watched the Order grow increasingly entangled with a corrupt institution, watched Senate procedures be used to protect the powerful rather than the governed, and had concluded publicly and articulately that this was wrong. His political philosophy attracted genuine believers. The Confederacy of Independent Systems had a civilian population, a parliament, a capital. Raxus was the Separatist capital, and it had senators and citizens and legislative debate. Mina Bonteri served there. She was a Separatist senator who had been a colleague and friend of Padme Amidala before the war split them across opposite sides. And in Season 3 of the Clone Wars, she introduces a formal peace resolution in the Separatist Parliament, a legitimate legislative proposal to open diplomatic negotiations with the Republic. Not a rhetorical gesture, an actual bill. She called for an end to the fighting through political means, as someone who had believed in the cause of independence and had also watched what the war was costing everyone paying for it. Padme meets with her illegally, traveling to Raxus undercover. Two women, former friends, on opposite sides of a galaxy-wide war, sitting together in a civilian home on the Separatist capital world and discussing whether the killing could stop. Dooku had Bonteri killed. He announced publicly that she died in a Republic attack. The Ultimate Star Wars reference book confirms this directly. He ordered her assassination and framed the other side. A peace advocate, eliminated to prevent peace, her death weaponized as propaganda to harden the population she had been trying to protect. Dooku did this because Palpatine needed the war running. Every time a genuine political solution appeared, every time an actual human being inside the Separatist movement tried to end the killing through legitimate means, someone with orders from the top removed them. The CIS wasn't a monolith of evil. It was a genuine political movement that had been hollowed out from the inside by a man who needed it to keep fighting on a schedule it didn't know existed. The people of the Confederacy were fighting for independence from a republic that had genuinely failed them. Their supreme commander was executing internal peace advocates on instructions from the supreme chancellor of that same republic. They didn't know that. Most of them never found out. The citizens of Raxus who believed in the cause, who thought they were building something more responsive to the worlds the core had discarded, were Palpatine's victims with the same completeness as the clone soldiers dying against them. The tragedy requires both sides to be real. They were both real. Here is the moment the entire architecture came the closest it ever came to collapsing. Clone Trooper CT-5555, known as Fives, had become one of the most individually developed soldiers in the entire Grand Army by year 3. Survivor of Geonosis, veteran of Umbara, where he had watched Pong Krell send his brothers into each other in the dark. A man who had developed, over 3 years of active combat, the habit of asking questions the system was designed to discourage. During an investigation into a clone commander's erratic behavior in the transitional period between 20 and 19 BBY, Fives pulled at a thread that led somewhere the Kaminoans and their patrons had assumed was buried too deep to find. A biochip in a clone trooper's brain, listed in Kaminoan records as a behavioral inhibitor, described vaguely as a safeguard against the aggressive tendencies that accelerated combat development could theoretically produce. Standard equipment, present in every clone from the beginning. Fives got one extracted from a dying trooper and had it analyzed. What the analysis showed was that the chip's listed function, suppressing aggression, was either incomplete or a deliberate misdirection. The chip appeared to be an override device, a protocol capable of bypassing everything a clone trooper had become, cutting through identity and loyalty and 3 years of built relationships, and executing a specific pre-programmed command sequence at a transmitted signal. Fives understood what this meant. He took it to the Jedi. He went to Anakin directly. He sought out anyone in the command structure with sufficient authority to investigate and act. He was intercepted before he reached any of them with enough clarity to be believed. Drugged. Framed for an assassination plot against Palpatine, specifically Palpatine, which is the detail that tells you exactly who was managing the interception. He died in Rex's arms in an alleyway on Coruscant, raving about chips and override signals, and a conspiracy running through every clone brain in the galaxy, dismissed as a soldier who had been broken by the very thing he was trying to warn everyone about. Months before Order 66, a clone trooper had functionally uncovered the entire plan. The chips were real. The override protocol was real. The war's ending mechanism had been living inside every clone soldier's skull since Kamino, installed over a decade before the first shot on Geonosis, waiting for a single transmitted order that Palpatine would send at exactly the moment he chose. Fives died knowing. The war kept moving. Nobody who survived heard him clearly enough to act. General Grievous. Two versions of this story exist, and they produce fundamentally different readings of what Palpatine was actually operating. In Disney canon, Grievous is a Kaleesh warrior who chose his cybernetic modifications voluntarily. Already a feared combatant, the official Star Wars databank describes him as a brilliant Separatist military strategist and a feared Jedi hunter. He enhanced himself by ambition. The mechanical arms, the respirator, the cape, the 4 lightsabers collected from fallen Jedi, choices made by a being who wanted more capability than biology could provide. His rage and his ferocity belong entirely to him. In the Legends continuity, specifically James Luceno's 2005 novel Labyrinth of Evil, written before the 2014 Disney Canon reset, the story is darker and more specific. Count Dooku engineered a shuttle crash that destroyed Grievous's organic body. Then Dooku saved him by placing what remained of the Kaleesh warrior into a cyborg chassis, leaving him alive, dependent, and believing with complete sincerity that he owed Dooku his survival. Grievous in that version didn't choose this. He was manufactured, from a living man, through a staged catastrophe. Both versions are directly relevant to the thesis. The canon version produces a separatist military with genuine autonomous capability, a supreme military commander who chose his condition, which means the war has real operational stakes on both sides, which is exactly what the controlled demolition required to function convincingly. A war with a credible military threat on the Separatist side is a war that justifies emergency powers, that justifies the deployment of an entire grand army, that justifies every expansion of Palpatine's authority. Grievous as a free agent makes the conflict real enough to be useful. The Legends version extends the scope of Palpatine's operation into territory that reframes the entire architecture. If Dooku manufactured Grievous from a living man through a fabricated tragedy, then the controlled demolition included building its own instruments from scratch. Not recruiting military commanders, making them, from people who had no idea the design existed. A Kaleesh warrior who had never met Palpatine becomes the supreme commander of the Separatist droid armies, because someone needed a military asset who would serve without asking questions, the wrong kind of questions. And the most efficient way to ensure that loyalty was to make Grievous believe he owed Dooku everything, up to and including the fact of being alive. Canon Grievous chose his condition. Legends Grievous was a weapon assembled from a man's surviving grief. Either way, the Kaleesh warrior who commanded CIS forces for the entirety of the Clone Wars died on Utapau in 19 BBY without ever understanding the actual structure of the war he had spent 3 years fighting. Both camps have strong arguments on the backstory. The comment section is the right place for that debate. 19 BBY, the final year. Every sequence from here runs in parallel. The Outer Rim sieges, simultaneous Republic offensives along the galaxy's outer territories, pulling the Order's most capable military commanders outward to the Rim. Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically, the Republic's 2 most visible and effective Jedi generals, deployed far from Coruscant, far from the Senate, far from Palpatine, at the precise moment Palpatine is sequencing the endgame. The war's final offensive campaigns were geographically structured to leave the center of the Republic thin, and to place Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically somewhere else when Anakin needed to make the final decision. Then, Grievous invades Coruscant, the capital planet, the Senate, the location of the Jedi Temple, a world that had not seen a Separatist fleet breach its defenses in living memory. And suddenly, a CIS armada is in the upper atmosphere, and Grievous is inside the government district, and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine has been abducted from the heart of the Republic, apparently taken by surprise, apparently in genuine danger. Obi-Wan and Anakin are recalled from the Outer Rim immediately. The canonical interpretation, supported across multiple independent sources, is that Palpatine engineered his own capture. He was never in genuine danger. The Battle of Coruscant was designed to produce one specific outcome. Anakin Skywalker aboard the Separatist flagship Invisible Hand, in a room with a kneeling, already defeated Count Dooku, with Palpatine watching from a chair. Dooku appears to have believed that Anakin would be captured or killed during the boarding action. What he didn't understand, because Palpatine had been carefully managing both men's understanding of each other for the entire duration of the war, was that Palpatine intended to tell Anakin to execute him. Dooku's hands had already been severed. He was on his knees. Palpatine instructed Anakin to kill him. Anakin killed him. Dooku had spent 3 years running the Confederate military, executing Palpatine's operational directives, eliminating peace advocates within the CIS, Mina Bonteri being the most documented case, and positioning the Confederacy for a defeat that would arrive on exactly Palpatine's timetable. He was removed in a transaction that simultaneously accomplished Palpatine's deeper objective, making Anakin Skywalker execute a helpless prisoner on the Chancellor's personal instruction. Not primarily because Palpatine needed Dooku dead on that specific day, because he needed Anakin to have done that, to have felt what it felt like to kill on Palpatine's word, and to have Palpatine respond with approval rather than horror. The Chancellor emerged from his captivity politically strengthened, publicly heroic, and with Anakin more emotionally indebted to him than at any previous point. Grievous escaped Coruscant. Obi-Wan was dispatched to Utapau. Anakin returned to Coruscant, to Padme, and to Palpatine's office, where the Chancellor had a story to tell him about a Sith Lord named Darth Plagueis, who had mastered the technique of preventing death. The siege of Mandalore ran simultaneously with all of this. Ahsoka Tano, no longer a Jedi, having left the Order after the Council's political failure to stand behind her during a trumped-up murder charge, a betrayal she had not yet fully processed, was leading Republic forces in retaking Mandalore from Maul. Not a Jedi. Operating under a temporary military commission, fighting alongside Rex, pursuing a former Sith Lord who had built a criminal empire across the Outer Rim in the power vacuum the war had created. Maul knew something. Not everything about Order 66, not the full mechanism, but enough to understand that Darth Sidious was moving toward an endgame, and that Anakin Skywalker was somehow central to it, in a way that made him dangerous to anyone standing nearby. He told Ahsoka on Mandalore's surface that Anakin was the key to what was coming, that she should consider killing him if she ever got the chance to save him. Ahsoka defeated Maul in the Sundari Royal Palace in single combat. She captured him. She loaded him into restraints aboard a Venator-class Star Destroyer called the Tribunal, in hyperspace, heading for Republic jurisdiction. The signal came in transit. Order 66. Rex's inhibitor chip activated. The clone troopers aboard the Tribunal turned and opened fire on Ahsoka. Rex himself, whose chip was fighting against years of being Rex, against every decision and attachment and identity that 3 years of war had built, managed to pass her a warning before the override fully took hold. She recognized what was happening. She found him, removed his inhibitor chip manually in a running firefight through corridors filling with troopers who had been her allies an hour earlier, and Rex came back to himself, gasping, in full recognition of what had nearly executed itself inside his own body. Together, on a ship that had become a killing floor, they survived. Most Jedi weren't next to someone who could do what Ahsoka did. Ki-Adi-Mundi was on Megiddo, mid-advance, when his clone troopers turned on him. Aayla Secura was on Felucia. Plo Koon was in the cockpit of his starfighter over Cato Neimoidia when the clone pilots who had flown with him for 3 years received the order and shot his ship out of the sky. Commander Cody, Obi-Wan's loyal second for the entire duration of the war, received Order 66 on Utapau seconds after Obi-Wan had killed Grievous, pointed at where Obi-Wan had fallen, and said fire. 3 years of building trust. 1 transmission to spend all of it. Order 66 wasn't a surprise attack. It was a scheduled end to a process that had been running since before Geonosis. The Jedi had spent 3 years becoming the commanders of an army with switches in their heads, not because the Jedi were naive, but because the war had been structured from inception to place them in precisely this position. Geographically dispersed across the Outer Rim, embedded in military command roles that made their physical isolation from each other operationally normal and logistically routine. Surrounded by soldiers they had bled with, trusted, built genuine bonds with over 3 years of sustained combat. The trust was the weapon. Palpatine needed 3 years to build it completely, enough to guarantee the outcome. The dark side veil over Jedi perception meant that Palpatine, their ally, their chancellor, their most frequent civilian contact throughout the war, the man who attended their memorial services and expressed concern for their losses with evident emotion, had been invisible to their most fundamental defensive sense for the entirety of his chancellorship. They knew their perception was occluded. Yoda felt it and acknowledged it. The Council debated it. None of them located the source, because the source had a key to the building and had been inside it the entire time. Darth Vader killed the Separatist leadership on Mustafar the same day Order 66 was transmitted. Dooku was already dead. Grievous was already dead. Within hours of the order going out, every operational element of the controlled demolition, both sides' command structures, had been wrapped up. The CIS leadership, who had spent 3 years believing they were fighting for genuine independence, were killed in a lava planet conference room by an entity they'd never been told existed. The Galactic Empire was proclaimed. Palpatine wept for the fallen Jedi with visible anguish, and the Senate gave him a standing ovation. Here is the full inventory of what fit inside only those 3 years. The First Battle of Geonosis, 22 BBY. Both armies deployed simultaneously, neither side given adequate time to prepare, because they were both Palpatine's armies, and he needed the opening act to look improvised. The Malevolence Campaign, a separatist superweapon that disabled entire Republic fleets, neutralized in the war's first weeks by Anakin, Obi-Wan, and a 14-year-old Padawan working without adequate intel. Christophsis, where Rex learned to command and Ahsoka learned to be commanded. Munilanced. The Second Battle of Geonosis, 21 BBY. Mon Cala, where a crown prince became a king after a Republic intervention that was also a strategic occupation. Dathomir, where an entire culture was eliminated overnight because a single member of that culture had been inconvenient to Dooku's operational schedule. Ryloth, 20 BBY. Liberation through bombardment, freedom delivered at civilian cost. Umbara, clones killing clones in alien darkness on the orders of a Jedi who had already defected, followed by those same clones arresting and executing that Jedi in the field. Onderon, the Republic training insurgents against one Separatist-aligned government, while running military operations against Separatist civilians on other worlds in the same quarter. Mina Bonteri's peace resolution, introduced and killed. Fives discovering the inhibitor chips, dying in Rex's arms in a Coruscant alley, with knowledge that no one in authority acknowledged until it was too late. The Night Sister massacre. Maul's return, his criminal empire, his warning to Ahsoka that she couldn't act on in time. The Outer Rim sieges, the staged Battle of Coruscant, Dooku's execution, kneeling, hands already gone. The Siege of Mandalore. Order 66, transmitted galaxy-wide, simultaneously, to more than 60 documented active theaters. Plo Koon's fighter going down over Cato Nemoidia, Rex's chip activating in hyperspace, the death of Grievous on Utapau, the death of the Separatist Council on Mustafar, the birth of the Galactic Empire. More than 60 named engagements across 3 years, 121 episodes of the Clone Wars animated series, plus a theatrical feature film, all of it set inside 36 months of in-universe time. Jedi dying on campaigns that produced no monuments. Clones aging at an accelerated rate, their entire adult lives spent inside a war designed before they were born. Separatist citizens fighting for independence from a republic that had genuinely abandoned them, without knowing that the man commanding their cause was also running the republic they were fighting against. Every exhibit on the same pile, all of it measured against the same 3-year clock. The compression is the evidence. Genuine political conflicts, the ones that emerge from real fractures and real human suffering, without a conductor setting the tempo, sprawl and stall and restart. They pause at negotiating tables and collapse and resume with different boundaries. History's actual contested political transformations sprawl for decades without clean resolution, because the people involved are actually making decisions in real time, because the chaos is real. The Clone Wars moved at the pace of a man who had already written the ending. He controlled the rate of escalation on both sides. He knew what conditions needed to be in place: an exhausted Jedi Order, a radicalized Anakin Skywalker, an emergency powers framework with no sunset clause, a grand army with chips in every skull. And he knew exactly how long creating those conditions would take. 3 years. Long enough to break the Jedi spiritually and institutionally. Long enough to push Anakin past the point of recovery. Long enough to make emergency powers feel like the normal condition of governance. Not so long that the Senate recovered its nerve, or that the Jedi located the source of the darkness they kept sensing in the Force. When Order 66 went out in 19 BBY, the Jedi weren't ambushed by something they never saw coming. They were the final exhibit in a case that had been building for 36 months. Every campaign contributed to their isolation. Every moral compromise contributed to their distance from the Force. Every year commanding clone armies built exactly the institutional trust that made the betrayal possible at scale. Darth Bane had established 1,000 years earlier that the Sith couldn't win through force. He was right. They won through patience, through infiltration, through making their enemy the instrument of their own destruction. Palpatine didn't win the Clone Wars. He used the Clone Wars to dismantle the only institution in the galaxy capable of stopping him, from the inside, in only the time he needed to do it. He set the clock before the first clone was deployed. Order 66 was the alarm going off, right on schedule. If you want more of this, the Grievous debate is waiting in the comments. Both camps have real arguments. Subscribe for more stories like this one.